By the autumn of 1887, the upper reach of the Sawtooth country had already earned its reputation as a place where careful men either learned fast or did not return home at all. The winters came down out of the high passes without warning, and when they broke against the timber line, they broke hard. Daniel Reeve, a 34-year-old trapper working the drainage north of Copperhead Ford, understood this better than most. He had buried a brother beneath a spruce root 9 winters earlier, a boy of 19 who had misjudged the weather by half a day and paid the full price for it. Since then, Daniel had learned to read the sky the way other men read scripture. He trusted no season, no cabin, and no promise made by warm weather. He was riding the ridge above the ford on a gray October afternoon when he first saw the falls. He had passed that stretch of country a dozen times before, but always from the lower trail along the river bottom, where the timber grew thick enough to hide the cliff face from view. This time, following a lame mule he had bought cheap in the Copperhead settlement, he cut higher along the shoulder of the ridge. The wind shifted. He heard the water before he saw it, a low, continuous voice rising through the pines like a conversation held just out of reach. When he finally topped the last rise and looked down, the falls stopped him where he stood. The water dropped nearly 90 feet in a single unbroken column, striking a black pool below and throwing up a mist that hung in the timber like breath on cold glass. But what caught Daniel's eye was not the water itself. It was the darkness behind the water. Along the middle third of the drop, the sunlight passed through the falling column and caught something hollow behind it. A shelf. A dark cut in the cliff face where the rock had eroded backward over centuries, leaving a shelter the falling water could not reach. Daniel tied the mule to a lodgepole and climbed down on foot. The descent took him an hour. When he finally worked his way behind the curtain of water along a narrow granite ledge no wider than a man's stride, he understood exactly what he was looking at. The shelf ran nearly 20 feet deep into the cliff. The floor sloped gently upward from the outer lip, so that any spray blown backward by the wind would drain away before it could pool against the inner wall. The ceiling curved high above his head, black basalt streaked with iron. And most importantly of all, the falls themselves poured down a full arm's length beyond the outer edge of the shelf. Daniel stood inside the shelter, dry as a chapel floor, and watched the water thunder past his boots without touching him. He listened for a long time before he climbed back up. He rode into Copperhead Ford 3 days later with a plan he had already committed to. The ferryman, a thick-shouldered man named Charles Whittock, listened to the whole thing without interrupting, then leaned back against the doorframe of his supply store and let out a long, slow breath. Charles had run the ford for 18 years. He had pulled bodies out of the river with his own hands. He looked at Daniel the way a man looks at someone about to make a mistake that cannot be undone. "You want to build a cabin," Charles said, "behind a waterfall." "Behind the flow line," Daniel corrected. "There's a shelf. The water doesn't reach it." "The water doesn't reach it now." Charles pushed off the doorframe and walked out into the cold sunlight. "You know what happens in spring, Daniel. You know what those falls do when the high country lets go and the melt comes down in 1 week instead of 2 months. That column doubles, triples. The water will crush you when it thaws. It'll fill that shelf like a mug filling with beer, and nobody up here will find enough of you to bury." Daniel did not argue. He had already looked at the flow line, already traced the water stains high up the cliff face where the falls had run at their fullest for 1,000 springs. He had measured, and he had counted, and he had decided. He bought his lumber the next morning. The lumber came out of a small mill 3 miles downriver from the ford, a place run by a Norwegian named Ingvar who cut spruce and lodgepole into rough beams for the mining camps higher up in the passes. Daniel bought 40 feet of squared timber, a bundle of split shakes for the roof, and 24 iron spikes long enough to hold green wood together through a mountain winter. He loaded the whole order onto a rented sled and drove it back toward the falls with a borrowed team of oxen he had promised to return by the first hard freeze. Charles watched him leave from the porch of the supply store without saying a word. Word had already spread through the settlement by then. Men at the mill had looked at Daniel the way farmers look at a horse standing too close to a cliff edge. The trail down to the shelf could not carry the sled. Daniel already knew that. He unloaded the timber at the top of the ridge and began the slow work of lowering it piece by piece down the granite face using a rope block he had rigged between two lodgepole pines. Each beam took nearly an hour to work down along the ledge behind the falling water. By the third day of hauling, his palms had split open beneath his gloves, and his shoulders ached deep into the joints. But the shelf itself remained dry, and every beam that reached the inner wall stayed dry with it. That was the proof Daniel needed. If the mist and spray could not soak green spruce lying flat on the stone floor, then no cabin built on that shelf would ever rot from water damage. He began the framing in the second week of October. The design was simple because the shelf itself dictated almost every choice. He set the back wall directly against the basalt so the mountain itself served as insulation. He built the two side walls short and thick, notched into the rising floor with iron spikes driven deep into pockets he chiseled out of the stone. The front wall he built last, and this was the wall he thought about longest. It faced the falling water. In summer, it would face nothing but mist. In winter, if his reading of the country was correct, it would face something else entirely. He left one small window in that wall, a square opening no larger than a man's face, set with a single pane of thick trading post glass he had wrapped in wool for the journey down the cliff. He finished the roof in the last week of October. The first hard snow came 4 days later. Daniel spent that first snowfall inside the finished cabin with a small iron stove burning green spruce, the pipe running out through a hole he had cut in the side wall and vented sideways along the granite, so the smoke would not stain the ceiling of the shelf above. He sat on a bench of his own making and watched the falling water outside his single window. The snow above the falls had begun to slow the flow already. The column no longer thundered the way it had in October. It ran quieter now, thinner, and Daniel could see the black cliff face on the far side of the pool through the gaps in the moving water. He had not lit the stove for warmth. The shelf sat deep enough into the mountain that the stone itself held a steady temperature just above freezing, even when the outside air dropped hard. He had lit the stove to test the chimney draw against a north wind, and the smoke pulled cleanly through the pipe and out into the mist without curling back into the room. That was the last thing he had needed to know. On the first day of November, Charles came up to see the cabin. He tied his mule at the top of the ridge, climbed down the ledge behind the falling water with the slow, careful movements of a man who did not trust the stone beneath his boots, and stood in the doorway of Daniel's finished home without speaking for nearly a full minute. He looked at the walls. He looked at the roof. He looked at the small square window facing the falls and at the black basalt curving overhead like the vault of a cathedral. Then Charles said quietly, "I still think this will kill you." Daniel did not answer him at first. He crossed the small room, took 2 tin cups from a shelf above the stove, and poured coffee from a pot that had been warming since before Charles began his descent. He handed 1 cup to the ferryman and kept the other for himself. The 2 men stood side by side in the doorway of the cabin, looking out through the falling curtain of water toward the pale October sky beyond. "You could be right," Daniel said finally, "but I've measured the flow line 3 times now. Once in July when the falls ran fullest, once in September, and once last week. The water hasn't touched this shelf in 1,000 years, Charles. Maybe 10,000. The rock behind us proves it. You look at the granite here. No water stains. No mineral deposits. No moss. This ledge is drier than the church floor down in the settlement." Charles took a long swallow from his cup and shook his head slowly. "Rocks lie, Daniel. They lie because they show you 1,000 years of summer, and they don't show you the one spring when the whole high country lets go at once. I've seen that river carry cordwood a mile downstream and stack it up against the ferry pilings like kindling. I've seen it eat through a stone bridge abutment in one afternoon. What you're looking at here is a good bet on ordinary years, but we don't get ordinary years anymore, not since the winter of '83. Daniel nodded slowly. He remembered '83. Every man in the Sawtooth country remembered '83. The snowpack had built to nearly 40 feet in the highest passes that winter, and when the thaw came in April, it had come in a single sudden week of southern wind that turned the rivers into moving walls of ice and timber. 2 settlements downstream from Copperhead had been erased entirely. Not damaged, erased. Charles was not warning him about ordinary risk. He was warning him about the kind of spring that came once in a generation and rewrote the map behind it. But Daniel had thought about 83 too. He had thought about it for weeks before he ever bought his first beam of lumber. And when he looked at the shelf behind the falls and traced the water stains up the cliff face on both sides of the flow, he had seen something Charles had not seen. The stains stopped a full 6 feet below the outer lip of the shelf. Even in 83, even in whatever had come before 83 across 10,000 springs of mountain runoff, the water had never once reached the ledge where he now stood. The mountain itself had already answered the question. Daniel had only had to learn how to read the answer. He did not try to explain this to Charles. He had learned long ago that a man who has decided something in his bones does not convince other men by argument. He convinces them by outliving the winter. So he only clapped Charles on the shoulder, took the empty tin cup from the ferryman's hand and walked him back to the ledge that led up the cliff. "Come see me at Christmas," Daniel said. "If I'm still here, we'll drink something stronger than coffee." Charles laughed, but the laugh was thin. He climbed the ledge slowly and did not look back until he reached the top of the ridge. When he finally turned to wave, Daniel was already gone from the doorway, back inside the cabin behind the falling water. The rest of November passed quietly. Daniel worked his trap lines along the drainage above the falls, running north into a shallow valley that held marten and beaver in numbers he had not seen in 3 seasons. He came home each evening through the deepening cold, climbed down the ledge in whatever light remained, and slept behind the sound of falling water. By the middle of the month, the falls had begun to change. The upper edge of the column had frozen first, forming a thick lip of blue ice along the cliff face above the drop. The water still fell, but it fell through a narrowing gap, and the mist that hung in the pool below had begun to freeze into long white plumes along the surrounding timber. By the first week of December, the falls had stopped moving altogether. Daniel woke on the morning of December 4th to a silence he had never heard before. He lay still on the narrow bunk against the back wall of the cabin, listening, trying to understand what had changed. For nearly 2 months, the sound of falling water had been the constant background of every hour of his life. It had thinned in November as the cold deepened, slowing from a thunder to a rush to a steady pouring hiss. But it had never stopped. Now it had stopped. He rose slowly and opened the door. Where the falling column of water had been the night before, there now stood a wall of ice. The transformation was almost impossible to comprehend at first. The falls had frozen in place mid-drop, the way a sculptor might have arrested them with a single blow of a chisel. The ice was not the dull white of packed snow. It was blue. A deep translucent blue that shifted toward turquoise where the morning light caught the outer edge, and toward the color of deep river water where the ice thickened against the shadowed rock. Long vertical veins ran through the column like the grain of some enormous piece of pale timber. Icicles as thick as a man's leg hung from the upper lip of the falls, and where those icicles met the frozen pool below, they had fused into pillars that reached from the roof of the shelf down to the ice floor like the columns of a cathedral. Daniel stepped out to the outer edge of the shelf and pressed one gloved hand against the ice. The wall was cold, but it was solid. It did not creak beneath his palm. It did not shift. When he tapped it with the handle of his knife, it rang with a low bell tone that told him the ice ran deep, at least a foot thick where he stood, thicker further out toward the pool. The falls had not simply frozen at their surface. They had frozen through their entire volume. What had been 90 feet of falling water was now 90 feet of standing ice, and between that ice and the black basalt behind him, Daniel Reeves stood inside a chamber the mountain had built and the winter had sealed. He walked back inside the cabin and did not light the stove. The temperature inside the shelf held steady that morning at just above freezing. Daniel checked it against the small brass thermometer he had brought down with him from Copperhead. Outside, the ridge above the falls read 14 below zero in the noon sunlight. Inside the cabin, with no fire burning, the reading held at 33. The ice wall in front of him and the granite mountain behind him had turned the shelf into something no cabin above the tree line could ever be. It was a room the outside cold could not enter, because there was no path for the outside cold to follow. The ice sealed the front. The stone sealed the back. And the small square window facing the falls now looked out into a pale blue light that filled the cabin with a glow like the inside of a lantern shade. He lit the stove that evening only for cooking, and even a handful of green spruce brought the room to an uncomfortable warmth within 20 minutes. He learned quickly to burn less than he had planned. He learned to cook once a day and let the residual heat of the iron stove carry him through the night. He learned that the frozen wall in front of him was not just protection from wind and cold. It was insulation of a kind no cabin on the mountain could match. He spent the rest of December in a quiet Daniel had never known. His trap lines ran well. The marten pelts thickened with the deep cold, becoming the most valuable he had taken in a decade. In the mornings, he would climb the ledge to check the trail above the ridge, and each time he returned in the evening, he would look at the blue ice wall from the outside before descending. From beyond the pool, the falls no longer looked like a waterfall at all. They looked like a sheet of blue glass hung against the cliff face, framed by white timber and dark stone, glowing faintly from within where the last thin light of the winter afternoon caught the far edge of Daniel's small window through the ice. He did not know it yet, but that faint glow would matter more than anything else he had built. Christmas came and went without a visit from Charles. Daniel had not truly expected one. The snow had piled deep across the ridge by the middle of December, and the trail from Copperhead Ford up to the falls was not a trail any sensible man would break through drifted timber for the sake of a promise made in October. Daniel spent the holiday alone inside the cabin behind the ice wall. He roasted a marten haunch on the small stove, drank coffee thick enough to stand a spoon in, and read from a battered edition of Marcus Aurelius that he had carried up from Copperhead in his coat pocket the previous fall. The blue light through the ice deepened toward evening into something that reminded him of the inside of a summer lake scene from below. He fell asleep early that night with the book open on his chest. The blizzard came 4 days after Christmas. Daniel felt it before he saw it. He had climbed the ledge to check his upper trap line on the morning of the 29th, and as he crested the ridge, the horse trail above the timber, he stopped in his tracks the way any mountain man stops when his body understands something his mind has not yet caught up to. The wind had died, not slowed, died. The pines above the drainage stood motionless. No bird moved through the timber. The sky to the north had taken on the color of wet lead poured into a mold and left to cool. Daniel had lived in the Sawtooth country long enough to know exactly what that meant. He turned around without checking a single trap and started back down the ridge toward the falls. He reached the cabin an hour before the first snow began to fall. He brought his mule down the ledge behind him this time, something he had never done before, leading the animal slowly along the narrow granite path with one hand on its halter and the other braced against the cliff face. The mule balked twice, once at the edge of the ledge and once at the entrance to the shelf itself, where the strangeness of the blue ice wall clearly disturbed it. But Daniel talked the animal through both refusals, and by the time the first hard flakes began sweeping across the ridge above them, both trapper and mule stood safely inside the shelter behind the falls. Daniel tied the mule to an iron ring he had driven into the granite along the back wall the previous month. He had planned for exactly this. He had cut a small stall into the deepest corner of the shelf and lined the floor with dry pine boughs against the cold of the stone. The mule settled uneasily at first, but the warmth from the cabin stove drifted back along the shelf and reached the animal within minutes, and after a while the mule lowered its head and began to eat from the small feed bag Daniel hung on the ring. Then Daniel closed the cabin door and waited. The storm hit the ridge above him in the third hour of the afternoon. He knew this only because he could hear it. The wind that came down out of the north struck the top of the cliff face above the falls and howled sideways across the timber with a sound like a locomotive passing at close range. Snow began to drive against the ice wall in front of him, and where the flakes struck the frozen falls, they did not stick. They swept sideways along the blue surface and vanished around the edges of the pool. The ice itself did not move. Behind it, inside the cabin, Daniel sat at his small table and listened to the storm that could not reach him. The temperature inside the shelf did not drop. He checked the brass thermometer at the first hour of the blizzard, at the third hour, at the sixth hour. The reading held at 32 degrees each time. Outside, above the ridge, he had no way to measure what the wind was doing, but he had lived through enough sawtooth blizzards to know the answer without the number. The kind of storm that killed men in this country pushed the felt temperature down past 50 below zero when the wind hit full strength. Somewhere above him, that was happening now. Inside the cabin, Daniel took off his coat. The blizzard held its grip on the sawtooth country for the better part of a week. Daniel counted the days by the burning down of a small tallow candle he kept on the shelf above his stove, and by the seventh burning, he had begun to understand something about the storm outside that no man in Copperhead would ever fully believe. Behind the ice wall, the wind speed was zero. Not low. Zero. The frozen falls acted as a barrier so complete that the storm above the ridge and the still air inside the cabin might as well have belonged to two different countries. When Daniel opened the door to check on the mule at the back of the shelf, no draft touched his face. The only movement of air inside the shelter was the slow rising of heat from the stove and the slow settling of cold along the outer edge where the ice met the stone floor. He began to spend hours at the small square window facing the falls. The view through the ice was not clear the way glass was clear. It was the view of a man looking out from inside a block of blue crystal, distorted at its edges, luminous in its center. But Daniel could see the storm through it. He could watch the snow driving sideways across the black pool below in horizontal sheets that never let up for an hour together. He could see the pines on the far side of the drainage bending nearly double under the wind, their upper branches stripped bare within the first day. He could see the drifts building against the base of the cliff on the far side of the pool, rising higher hour by hour, until by the fifth day of the storm they had risen halfway up the trunks of the timber. And through all of it, behind the blue ice, Daniel Reeves sat in a room where the air did not move and the temperature did not fall, and he watched the worst winter storm in a decade the way another man might watch weather through the window of a warm hotel dining room. He learned things during those days that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. He learned that a man alone in a sealed shelter did not fear the cold the way a man alone in a canvas tent feared it. He learned that firewood used sparingly could last 4 times longer than firewood used generously. He learned that the small brass thermometer told a story his body already knew. And he learned, sitting long hours by the blue window with the book of Marcus Aurelius open on his knee, that the still air of a shelter the wind could not enter carried a silence that felt different from any silence he had ever known before. It was not the silence of empty country. It was the silence of a room the world could not find. On the morning of the 6th day, Daniel heard the tapping. At first he thought it was the mule. He set his coffee down and listened. The tapping came again, quicker now, 3 sharp reports followed by a pause, then 3 more. The mule stood quietly at the back of the shelf. Daniel rose slowly and crossed to the window. The tapping was coming from the ice wall itself, somewhere below and to the right of his own position. He pressed his face against the small pane of glass and tried to see through the frozen curtain toward the source of the sound. He could not see clearly enough. The blue distorted everything at the outer edges of the falls into pale shapes that suggested but did not confirm. He opened the cabin door. The tapping was louder here, sharper. It was coming from a point along the outer face of the frozen falls, perhaps 8 or 10 feet down from the upper lip of the shelf. Daniel walked out onto the outer edge of the ledge, close enough to press his ear against the blue ice. The tapping came a third time, unmistakable now, and beneath it, muffled by the ice and the storm together, he heard a human voice. He could not make out the words, but he could make out the tone. It was the tone of a man calling for help who was very close to no longer being able to call at all. Daniel turned and ran back into the cabin for his axe. The axe he chose was not the felling axe he had used for lumber back in October. It was a smaller camp axe, sharp at the head, narrow at the bit, the kind of tool a man used for splitting kindling and cutting through frozen harness leather. He took it from its peg above the stove and came back out onto the outer edge of the shelf within 30 seconds of hearing the voice. The tapping was still there, weaker now, but there. Daniel dropped to one knee at the point along the ice wall where the sound was strongest. He struck the first blow carefully, angling the axe head downward, so the impact would drive a shallow chip loose rather than a deep crack. A palm-sized flake of blue ice spun away from the wall and skittered across the granite floor. He struck again. Another flake broke free. He worked in short, precise strokes, the way a stonemason worked a facing stone rather than the way a woodcutter felled a tree. He could not afford to split the wall. If he cracked it wide, the wind above the ridge would come through the opening like water through a broken dam, and the shelter he had built would fail in an afternoon. He called out as he worked, "I'm coming, hold on, hold on." The tapping answered him, once then again. Then it stopped. Daniel struck faster. The ice was thicker here than he had guessed, nearly 2 feet at its outer face, and the axe made slow progress against the density of the frozen falls. Sweat ran down beneath his wool shirt inside the cabin's warmth, but his hand stayed steady on the haft. He worked for perhaps 20 minutes before the axe head finally punched through into open air on the far side, and a thin whistle of wind came screaming through the gap. He widened the opening carefully. He did not make it larger than he had to. When the hole was big enough for a man's shoulder, he stopped chipping and looked through. A face looked back at him. It was the face of a boy of maybe 17, blue at the lips, white with frost across the eyebrows and beard stubble, one eye half swollen shut where the wind had frozen the lid to itself. Daniel recognized him after a long second. It was Thomas Whittock, Charles's older boy, who ran mail up the mountain routes for the settlement office in Copperhead. Daniel had seen him in the ferryman's store a dozen times, always laughing, always moving too fast for his own good. The boy could not speak. He could only push one gloved hand through the hole toward Daniel, and Daniel took the hand and held it while he worked the opening wider with his other arm. He chipped until the gap was large enough to pull a full-grown man through. Then he set the axe down and reached out into the cold with both hands and pulled Thomas Whittock through the ice wall and onto the granite floor of the shelf. The boy collapsed against Daniel's chest without a sound. His coat was frozen stiff. Ice caked the mail satchel still slung across his back. Snow packed the tops of his boots and the folds of his scarf, and the exposed skin of his face had gone the color of tallow beneath the frost. Daniel got both arms beneath him and half carried, half dragged him through the cabin door and laid him on the pine bunk against the back wall. Then Daniel moved fast. He had seen men come in from cold like this before. He knew what the next hour would decide. He stripped the frozen coat off the boy first, then the boots, then the wet wool socks that had begun to fuse to the skin of the feet. He wrapped Thomas in every blanket he owned, laid a second layer of dry wool over the blankets, and then began the slow, careful work of feeding heat back into a body the storm had nearly emptied. He warmed water on the stove. He held the boy's frozen fingers between his own palms. He did not rub the skin. He had learned long ago that rubbing frozen tissue killed it faster than the cold had. By the time Thomas Whittock opened his eyes, Daniel had already gone back out to seal the hole in the ice wall with packed snow and a folded oilcloth. The boy did not speak until the second morning after Daniel pulled him through the ice. He drifted in and out of a heavy sleep through the first day, waking only to swallow the broth Daniel spooned into him from a tin cup, and even that took him nearly a minute at a time to get down. His face slowly returned to something resembling color by the end of the first afternoon, but the 2 smallest toes on his right foot had gone black by then, and Daniel knew without saying anything that those toes would not be there by the time the boy left the shelter. That was a conversation for later. For now, he only needed Thomas to keep breathing and keep swallowing warm liquid, and by nightfall the boy was doing both. When Thomas finally spoke on the second morning, his voice was rough as split cedar. He said, "I saw a light." Daniel had been feeding split kindling into the stove. He set the piece in his hand aside and turned to face the bunk. "A light," the boy said again. "Inside the water. Blue. I was up on the ridge and the wind had me. I couldn't see the trail. I couldn't see anything. I was going down, Mr. Reeve. I was going down for good, and I looked over the cliff and there was a light inside the waterfall." Daniel understood then what had happened. His own small square window, faced with a single pane of thick trading post glass, had been lit from the inside by the stove and the candle he burned through the storm. That light, passing through the ice wall of the frozen falls, had spread through the blue crystal for perhaps 20 feet in every direction from the pane itself. A faint glow the color of deep river water that had no business existing anywhere on a mountain in the middle of the worst blizzard in a decade. Thomas Whittock, dying on the ridge above the falls with his mail satchel frozen to his back, had seen that impossible glow through the driving snow. And he had gone toward it because a man about to die will go toward any light that reaches him, whether he understands it or not. "How did you get down the cliff?" Daniel asked. Thomas did not remember. He remembered climbing over the edge of the ridge. He remembered falling or sliding, he was not sure which. He remembered lying on the frozen surface of the pool at the base of the falls and hearing his own breath echo back to him off the ice. And then he remembered crawling. He had crawled along the base of the frozen falls until the blue glow was directly above him, and then he had begun tapping the ice with the handle of his belt knife because he did not have the breath left to shout. "You should not be alive," Daniel said quietly. "You know that." "I know it," the boy said. They sat with that fact between them for a long moment. Then Thomas closed his eyes and slept again, and Daniel returned to the stove and fed the piece of kindling into the fire. The storm broke on the 8th day. Daniel woke to a stillness that was different from the stillness inside the shelf, a stillness that reached down from above the ridge and settled across the whole drainage. He opened the door and stepped out onto the outer edge and looked up through the blue ice toward the sky. He could see it now, faintly, a pale winter sun burning through the frozen curtain like a lamp seen through smoked glass. The world above had ended its long violence. The country beyond the falls lay under snow so deep that the timber on the far ridge looked like a black rope stretched across a white sheet. Daniel climbed the ledge that morning alone. Thomas was not yet strong enough to make the ascent. When Daniel reached the top of the cliff, he stood for a long time and looked out across the ridge toward Copperhead Ford in the valley below. Even from that height, he could see that the settlement had suffered. Roofs had collapsed under the snow load. The steeple of the small church that had stood at the head of the main street since 1879 was gone. A dark scar of broken timber marked the place where it had come down. Daniel started back down the ledge to tell Thomas that his father would be waiting. It took Daniel 3 days to break a trail down the ridge to Copperhead Ford. He went alone at first. On snowshoes he had built himself from ash and rawhide the previous autumn, carrying only a small pack and a folded note from Thomas that he intended to deliver to Charles the moment he reached the settlement. The boy was still too weak to travel. Daniel had left him with the mule for company, a full stove of split spruce, and enough marten stew on the back of the iron top to last 3 days without cooking again. He had also left him with the axe he had used to chip through the ice, in case anything went wrong at the cabin while he was gone. Thomas had promised, weakly but honestly, that he would not try to climb the ledge until Daniel returned. The trail down to the ford took Daniel 11 hours the first day and 8 the second, and by the third afternoon he was moving through country he recognized again. The pines along the lower drainage stood shaggy with snow, but the wind had come out of them, and the sunlight through the branches made the whole valley look like a country nobody had ever walked through before. Daniel came down onto the frozen surface of the Copperhead River just above the ferry landing at the beginning of the 3rd evening. Charles saw him from the porch of the supply store before Daniel had crossed halfway across the ice. The ferryman ran. Charles Whittock had not run for anything in 18 years, but he ran across the frozen river toward Daniel Reeve with his coat unbuttoned and his boots slipping on the snow. And when he reached him, he took him by both shoulders and stared into his face without speaking. He had heard nothing of Thomas since before the blizzard. The boy had been due back from the mail route on the 28th of December. Charles had assumed for a full week that his son was dead. Daniel handed him the note. Charles read it 3 times before he could speak. Then he sat down on the ice in the middle of the frozen river and put his head in his hands, and Daniel stood beside him quietly and waited. When Charles finally rose, his face had gone the color of a man who has just been given something he had already taught himself to live without. He asked one question. "Is he whole?" Daniel told him about the toes. Charles nodded slowly. Then he looked up the ridge toward the falls, invisible now behind the winter timber, and he said, "The light in the waterfall." He wrote about the light in the waterfall. "He saw the window," Daniel said. "The stove light through the pane. It carried through the ice." Charles stood on the frozen river and looked at Daniel for a long time. The 2 men had known each other for 11 years. Charles had warned Daniel in October that the water would crush him when it thawed, and Daniel had built the cabin anyway. And now the ferryman's son was alive in that cabin behind that same water because Daniel had built it. Neither of them said any of that aloud. Neither of them needed to. They walked together back across the ice toward the supply store on the far bank, and Charles told his wife the news at the door with a voice that broke twice before he finished the sentence. Thomas came down from the falls at the end of January, walking on his own with a slight limp from the 2 missing toes and a permanent slowness along the right side of his gait that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Charles had climbed the ledge himself to help bring the boy down, and Daniel had watched them from the doorway of the cabin as they worked their way slowly up the granite trail, with the mule following behind. When Charles reached the top of the ridge with his son beside him, he turned back and looked down toward Daniel one last time. He did not wave. He only nodded once slowly, and Daniel nodded back. The spring thaw came late that year. It came in the 2nd week of April, and it came the way Charles had warned it would come, a full sudden release of the high country pack in the space of 6 days. Every settlement along the Copperhead braced for what was coming. Every settlement along the Copperhead sent men up the ridge to see what would happen to the cabin behind the falls. They came up the ridge in a party of 9, led by Charles and Ingvar the mill owner, on the 2nd morning of the thaw. Daniel had been expecting them. He had climbed the ledge at first light and stood at the top of the cliff waiting, coffee still warm in a tin flask inside his coat. When Charles came around the last bend in the trail with the other men behind him, Daniel raised the flask in greeting and said only, "You're just in time." The men gathered along the top of the ridge and looked down at the falls. The ice had begun to break apart 3 days earlier, and the water beneath it was already running at twice its autumn volume. The blue crystal wall that had sealed the shelf through the blizzard was gone now, shattered and washed downstream in blocks the size of freight wagons, and the falls thundered down the cliff face in a column heavier than anything Daniel had seen since he first stood on that ridge the previous October. The pool below churned white and brown with mountain silt. Whole trees came down from the high country carried by the flow, splintered against the granite and swept away. The men waited to see the cabin destroyed. That was why they had come. They had come to see the ferryman proven right and the trapper proven a fool, because that was the story the country had been telling itself all winter, and the country wanted to know how the story ended. Daniel let them wait. He drank his coffee slowly. Then, when Charles finally looked at him with a question in his face, Daniel led the whole party down the ledge along the granite trail behind the falling water. The cabin stood dry. It stood dry the way it had stood dry in October and in November, and through every day of the blizzard and every day since. The shelf sat behind the flow line by nearly a full arm's length, and even now at the height of the spring release, the water poured past the outer lip of the ledge without touching the shelter behind it. Mist filled the air along the outer edge. The sound of the falls was thunderous. But inside the cabin, with the door open, the stove ran cold and the floorboards were dry, and the small pane of trading post glass in the front window looked out through the water at the pale April sky beyond. Charles walked the entire length of the shelf with his hand pressed flat against the granite. He tested the wall behind the cabin. He tested the floor beneath his boots. He walked to the outer edge and looked at the water pouring past him a foot beyond his face, and he stood there for a long time. When he finally turned back toward Daniel, his face carried the expression of a man who has just been told something he understood but had refused to believe for 20 years. "The rock told you," Charles said. "The rock told me," Daniel answered. The other men said nothing. Ingvar looked at the joinery of the cabin walls the way a lumberman looks at good work. The rest of the party simply stood in the shelter behind the falling water and understood, one by one, what Daniel Reeve had understood the previous October when he first climbed down the cliff face and stepped behind the curtain of water into the dry hollow beyond. Charles built his second cabin on the same shelf the following autumn. He built it 15 feet down from Daniel's, into a smaller pocket of the same granite ledge, and he brought his wife and Thomas up from Copperhead Ford to live behind the falls with him. The two families wintered together for the next 11 years. The story spread from there, the way stories spread in the mountain country, carried by teamsters and mail riders and traded across supply store counters through the long evenings of the following winters. Different versions circulated in time. Some claimed the ice wall had grown 2 feet thick during the blizzard. Some claimed Thomas Whittock had tapped on the ice for a full day before Daniel heard him. A few even claimed the light through the window had been visible from Copperhead Ford itself, 15 miles away across the timber. But every version kept the same ending, and the ending was always the same. The blizzard had raged for a week across the whole Sawtooth country, and the man who built his cabin behind the falling water had never once felt the wind. Because Daniel Reeve had not built his cabin against the winter. He had built it behind the winter, in the one place the winter could not reach.